Stargate Voyager.
Well, I am excited to be back for another episode reviewing season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse. And in this episode, I am joined by fellow researcher, filmmaker, Joel Telford, who goes by JT Follows JC on social media. Good to have you back after our last interview a month or so ago, which, man, that video we did on the mud flood cover-up got a ton of traction on Spotify, especially on YouTube. Man, people really found it controversial.
Yes, they do.
Let's just say controversial to say the least. So what were your thoughts on what you saw from that?
The mud flood it's something that, like, once you're willing to look into it, there's something there. So I don't really try to say I have any definitive conclusions about that, but I mean, there is a lot more research to be done in that area. And I think the craziest part is, like, again, when I got censored on, like, Facebook and, and also Instagram, saying it's been debunked. And I was like, there's a lot of evidence. So, like, I can't really tell you exactly what it all means and how it all happened, but no, the big lead did not debunk it. They just said it's not true. And then obviously it almost feels like when they start to fact check that kind of stuff, it feels like maybe you're a little bit more of the target. Because if it was just a crazy, outlandish theory, like, why would they care?
Yeah, well, it got a lot of traction, and I got a lot of great feedback too. People just amazed by the subject. Some people had never heard of this mud flood or Tartaria. And again, some people just get triggered by all of it, but it was fun to say the least. Everybody follow JT on Instagram, on YouTube, TikTok at JT Follows JC. And I wanted to ask you before we jump into reviewing Ancient Apocalypse, you put out a couple videos lately that have gotten my attention. One was underground cities in Seattle, which I live about an hour from Seattle. And then the other one was on these stamped bricks that were found in San Francisco. So for people who know nothing about this, kind of break these down and tell them where they can find these videos.
Well, yeah, so I just started this new kind of, like, podcast series, and I call it JT's Mixtape. And I basically take some of the, videos I find on social media that are interesting, and we discuss them. So obviously, if anything, like, again, we're talking about the mud flood, if anything relates to that, that's obviously going to be something that I would feature if I find it interesting. And so on the last episode, I featured 2 videos. One of them, was about, it's kind of like this woman from TikTok doing a very traditional take about the underground parts of Seattle. And then I did another one where a guy kind of did some boots in the ground research in San Francisco. Now, the one in Seattle is funny because, again, we're talking about the mud flood on the podcast. And it's just like the mainstream narrative on how there became an underground part of Seattle was just, I don't know. Like I said, obviously I'm kind of incredulous that people believe this, because they're saying that, people go to Washington, Seattle, they start building the city, and for some reason it's flooding constantly from the very start. And the woman literally says that they had to have life preservers on the street because I guess you might be swept away in a flood at any moment. And I just, like, okay, I don't know. I don't really, that doesn't seem very plausible to me. So then, of course, in 1889, it burns down. Like in every major city in America, sure enough, there's a great fire. The city burns down. So then they're like, oh, well, this is a great opportunity to fix the flooding problem. So then they decide to build on top of the old city after the fire. And that's why there's an underground part now. And I'm just like, does that really make any sense? Like, wouldn't the underground part be kind of, I don't know, flooded if it flooded before? And then, just like the whole narrative. And it's like, but then we go over to, like, places like San Francisco, and I showed this wall. Like, it's like I think it's actually was Los Lobos Highway. And there's this interesting, I don't know, rock formations, melted brick, melted things. And the guy actually pulled out partial preserved bricks, and they had stamps on them. I guess they said T-Car on them, which is like a brick company from, like, the early 1800s from England, believe it or not. And yeah, parts of these bricks are melted. And so then obviously that was another controversial video because I was saying, like, what happened here? And so a lot of people say, hey, dummy, don't you know that San Francisco had a bunch of great fires? And I try to remind people, I'm like, normal fire is not hot enough to melt bricks. Do you know what your fireplace is made out of? It's made of bricks because they don't melt. And I think they say, like, to melt those certain kind of bricks, it takes 2,800 degrees. So a house fire, like these stories about these fires from like either the early 20th century or late 18th century. It's all, like what's the famous one from Chicago? Some cow kicks over a lamp and the whole city burns down. Okay. So like if that happened, that's not hot enough to melt bricks and stones and do all the kind of things. But I guess it's all that being said, there's some very interesting things around the country that I think that people are starting to like look at with different eyes. Like, what is that? Like, how did that get there? And it's like, it does seem to me, and we actually featured another video about these kind of a goofy video about tunnels under Los Angeles. They called it the Actor Bond, and there was like Starbucks under the, I don't know. I mean, like it seems silly to me, but the point being was that and after I released these videos, so many people in the comments, oh yeah, there's an underground part of our downtown. There's like every major city has like tunnels or like an underground city part of their city. They all experience major fires at some point. And I'm just saying this is like, it's interesting how it does relate to possibly the idea of a mud flood. It seems like what these underground cities are literally like multiple stories of old buildings that are under the ground. That, I mean, I believe that at some point were above ground, but now they're not. And we have lots of questions about that.
Yeah, so interesting because I live again here in Washington State, not far from Seattle. I've always heard about the underground tour in Seattle, and I've never gone on it. I guess because I'm here, and it's just like you're used to it. But man, yes, after your video, I'm going on that tour as soon as possible, and I'm going to take exclusive footage for you. How's that sound?
I love that idea. That's fantastic. Yeah, I think even in Portland, I think they have an underground part as well, and like Sacramento, and so all those places all have similar stories.
Well, one thing that caught my attention from the video you spliced together was that if it was actual footage from the Seattle underground city, if the fire burned the whole city to the ground back in the 1800s, why are all the storefronts not burned underground?
Right. Wouldn't the first floors be as burned as the other parts of the, I mean, like, that's what I was trying to think. Like, okay, so how does a fire burning the place down make it easier to build on top of it? And also, it's like, what does that even look like to you? Like in y'all's mind, what does that even look like when they said they built a city on top of the old city? It's kind of like in the way that I mentioned in the last video when I said, just like Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is not a pyramid, so like it's under the ground. Like, you know what I mean? It's like literally under the ground. So like, what does that even? So in your mind, how would you go about building a city on top of another city? You know what I mean? Like, would you have to get a lot of dirt in? I mean, like, you know how crazy that sounds? Like we're talking about a very early time of America, like the wild, wild West days, and they decide that it would be easier to build on top of the city that floods all the time and just burn down than it would be to, like, I don't know, build somewhere else.
Build somewhere else with a solid foundation.
Yeah, it seems like that if all those buildings burn down, wouldn't the structural integrity maybe be weakened in some of these places, and it might not be the easiest built on top of?
I'm definitely going to have to take a tour there. Like I said, I'll have to share the footage with you. I'm going to be excited to see what I find underground in Seattle.
Me too.
Maybe I will be the one that finds some exclusive footage that is the smoking gun proof of the mud flood, right?
That'd be fantastic. I'm rooting for you.
Well, JT, again, thanks for joining me. I am excited to break down episode 5 of Ancient Apocalypse season 2. Hopefully you guys watching or listening have been enjoying these recaps. I thought it was just kind of something fresh, new to do. This show, as I've been saying, is pretty controversial. Some people love it. Some people hate it. Some people think Graham Hancock, who's featured in this show, is just a total pseudoscience wannabe, and others think he's one of the greatest history researchers of all time. I think it's worth watching, and it's on Netflix if I didn't state that. And I would say it's worth subscribing to Netflix, even if it's just to watch this season and season one. And episode 5 starts out with Graham in the Amazon again, where he's kind of talking about this ayahuasca, this ancient psychedelic. What would you call it? Not medicine, but
A psychedelic brew.
a
What does
brew.
he
That
like
was
to?
the
Yeah.
word. So Graham was breaking down how does taking ayahuasca relate to the strange art of geometric patterns we see and visions of entities. And it means in Quechuan, it means vine of souls. And then so it shows Graham again investigating this art that we see in the Amazon, that we see in Peru, that's got all these crazy patterns, humanoid looking beings. And Graham suggests that this ayahuasca was being used as long ago as 13,000 plus years ago in what he calls the last ice age. And then it shows him taking us back to the immense geoglyphs we saw in episode 1 that emerged from the jungle in Brazil, where there's these 3D earthworks that are fantastic to look at, three-dimensional, enormous scale. And again, Graham theorizes were they basically creating what they saw in their visions from the ayahuasca? JT, what do you think about this whole ayahuasca part?
I thought it's interesting that like the just Graham Hancock, just from what I know of him, I was one of those people who found him listening to Rogan years ago. And I found based on listening to him, I think the only thing he's more interested than ancient stuff is drugs. So he's this you knew he was going to go there, and I think it's interesting his take on it. The one thing I found very interesting about his take on ayahuasca was how agnostic he was about what the Inca supposedly used it for. They used it to drug the victims who they were sacrificing to help them enter the afterlife. And I was like, wow, that's really dark. You know what I mean? Like that he just kind of just goes right past that. Yeah, and I heard him say, he called it's translates into ayahuasca translates into vine of the souls. I also remember him saying to Rogan that it's vine of the dead. And so it's interesting to me. I think if you dig deeper into the legends of these peoples who live in these lands, and they claim like, their ancestors. Sometimes they talk about giants having some kind of relation to these megaliths. From the Book of Enoch, we know that the deceased Nephilim, the giants, became the spirits. And so if that is who they're contacting, it kind of makes sense. Like, so if you're literally contacting through this psychedelic brew the ancestors who likely had a hand in building these things. So I mean, I don't think necessarily that he's wrong about that. It is interesting, like this connection with this ayahuasca and also the things they make. But in the same way that there is a sacred geometry, I believe that's even like as a Christian guy, I can point to that and saying that like the Fibonacci pattern and the things in nature, it's like, it points to a creator. So like that, if you'll see geometric patterns everywhere if you're looking for them. Maybe they are more vivid because again, I've never experienced anything like that. I've never touched anything that strong.
You brought up how the Inca did this human sacrifice, and yeah, this is a very dark part of the Inca culture that I don't think most people realize is that the Inca were huge into human and even child sacrifice. And even when an Inca emperor died, a quantity of his, jewels, his wealth, treasure was buried with him, including huge numbers sometimes of his attendants and favorite concubines, amounting sometimes it's said to like 1,000 people alone that could be sealed and killed in his tomb with him.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, in one instance, as many as 4,000 servants, court officials, concubines were killed upon the death of Inca Huayna Capac in 1527. And so that's just crazy to consider, right? 4,000 people were killed upon the death of this emperor and buried with them. How would you like to be one of those,
Oh
sir?
gosh. I guess that's incentive if you're like the doctor and everybody be like, we need to keep him alive. You bet. Have you checked on him today? I mean, so were these people, I mean, they weren't buried alive or anything. Were they sacrificed too? I mean, like what, like how?
I mean, I wonder if some were buried alive, but at least, if anything, they were sacrificed. And again, I think it probably involved ayahuasca and this whole ceremony, and they would do it out at these what we call huacas in Peru, which were not made by the Inca. These were the precision carvings that you see of the rock outcroppings and in the caves, the trapezoidal doors,
Mm-hmm.
by which I believe was the earlier megalithic civilization. But the Inca held these to be so just sacred that this is where they did a lot of they repurposed them all as like cult centers.
You know, I can't help but think, and I feel like that the obvious connection to make, especially as all the research I've done, is that if you're contacting these spirits, these ancestor spirits, and when they're using this brew, this drug, they are engaging in human sacrifice, child sacrifice. Is that not demonic? I mean, it's like kind of like that. If we, you know, based on the Book of Enoch, and I think you can find scriptural backup for this. That yes, these unclean spirits were like what we would know today as demons. You know, like in my worldview, I don't believe in ghosts as in like the ghost of your grandma. I believe that they're spirits and they call them familiar spirits and they might know things about you. And sometimes people might think that they're contacting a close relative who just recently died. But I think based on the way these beings are talked about, you know, even I think was it like the daughter of the sun? That's the channel you can open to this. Even think about it. So like that biblically, you could say that the sons of God are angels. And so they had human offspring, and those would be what you would call Nephilim, or like maybe your giants. So the daughter of the sun almost does sound like the sun god came down, and there you go. Then this is her daughter. And so this would be like a Nephilim, possibly some kind of a giant being. So when she died, you know, the Book of Enoch says there's really no place for these beings because God really never intended them to be. So some were destined to roam the earth as evil spirits, unclean spirits, and then some were put into the earth. And so when you see what's related to this and contacting them, and somehow, obviously, I believe probably some way pacifying these beings to get knowledge from, it involves sacrifice. I mean, like that is dark. I mean, like, you know, kind of what I do think it's sometimes people don't want to think past this, and I don't blame them. Like, why would people sacrifice other people like that? You know, because I don't think it's a normal human instinct to do that. You know, because I think we all recoil when we think like, why would they do that? I think that it's very likely that there was, you know, a good reason they did it. I mean, well, maybe not a good reason, but like there was a method to this madness.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw episode 4, where Graham was in Peru, in Cusco area, and he went to this thing called the Temple of the Moon. I broke that down in the last episode of episode 4, but it's interesting with what you're saying. A lot of these sites, like this one called the Moon Temple, it's in the Cusco Highlands, way up.
Mm-hmm.
And you go out, and from a distance, it just looks like an old rock kind of hill outcropping. But you get closer and you realize this thing is severely weathered, but it was all precision carved.
Mm-hmm.
And legends say that it was once actually in the shape of a giant animal. But you see this precision door that goes down like an upside down triangle, and that's the entrance into this subterranean chamber called the Temple of the Moon, also known as the Snake Temple.
Ooh.
And as you're walking in, you literally see precision cut walls and literally 3D serpents emerging out of the walls that line this hallway that goes down. So you literally see serpents emerging, protruding from the walls. And again, the Inca used this, I believe, as one of their places of sacrifice and worship, because you go inside, There's an altar, and if you're watching by video, I'll put a picture up of me sitting on this thing. There's an altar where a hole in the cave shines down right on this circular altar, precision cut. But again, the Inca, I believe, found this because according to the legends from our guide, Rumi, and others, knowledge keepers, this was a far older temple. And the Inca would come to venerate the entities that literally lived in the subterranean world underneath.
Oof.
And he said, "You don't believe me?" He pulls up this rock in this one area of the floor of this cave, and air comes blasting out, and you could literally hear, like a subterranean tunnel cave system underneath, if that makes sense. And again, Rumi says the back steps that used to go down to there have been sealed off, but his point was it wasn't just um, a supernatural subterranean world. He says they believe there was actual entities, chimeras, hybrids that were serpentine beings that lived underneath, and they were the ones they were sacrificing to. The Inca were. So how crazy is that?
I mean, it kind of all checks out. I mean, it kind of goes with all the other things we're talking about. It's like even think about, so he's saying that when you see geometric shapes, and it was almost like he was saying, like, the first time you do it, you see geometric shapes. But if you do it more than that, many people encounter these things called therions. And so therions were these hybrids between men and beasts. So maybe that, obviously then they see the serpents, obviously there's something related to that. What I found really interesting is a connection I made a year or two ago, and it was about just think about the names of things. And this could be just a coincidence, but I don't really believe in coincidences anymore. So ayahuasca. So in the research I've done into the occult, there's Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley famously wrote the Book of the Law. He's the guy who's got that mantra, the "Do what thou wilt." He's, he founded like a secret society, the Thelemites. Well, interestingly enough, when he wrote the Book of the Law, he claimed to channel an entity, and he made clear that it was not him who was writing this book. And the being's name was Ayahuasca. And I thought that's just kind of interesting, like that this was like some kind of a god of ancient Sumar. And, like as a Christian, I would say that, it's a demonic entity. And part of this book, he wrote that we're approaching this new age. I believe it's probably like the age of Aquarius. And then it was going to be the age of Therion. I thought, so like think about it. So like he's literally talking about like this beast thing. It's I guess Therion is a Greek word that talks about it, like it's for beast, I think. Yeah, but he was calling himself Therion 666, the beast 666. And so yeah, think like ayahuasca, and he's channeling this ancient entity that's giving him knowledge to write this thing, knowledge of the Kabbalah and all the other things. I think it all checks out. And again, like, so then you're talking about like in Peru, they are doing this. Again, that's my belief here. And I think it's like, we might just look in the Western world in 2024, and we just hear about primitive people doing sick things. I don't think man has ever been stupid. Like, so I think there's a reason they do these things. And it doesn't mean it's a good reason, but I do believe they did them for a reason. I don't think that like you have the evidence of advanced civilization and they just did crazy things just on the side. I think that there's a method to the madness. And I think that, yeah, like interesting how it kind of relates even to the mud flood, like all the tunnel systems, like how many tunnel systems are around the world? Like, I mean, they're everywhere.
Tunnel systems, geoglyphs, geometric patterns. And that's one of the things that Graham weaves through this whole episode. So like he shows us these geoglyphs in the Amazon, and then he says, were these made due to the consumption of ayahuasca? And then he says these are eerily similar to what we see in Ohio in the massive Hopewell ceremonial earthwork mounds there. And if you're watching by video, I'll put some photos and videos up of these mounds, but you can see how they do look right here in Ohio in the United States of America. We have these ancient mounds where this mound culture was thriving in the Great Lakes area. They say approximately 2,000 years ago. And these mounds feature, or these earthworks feature ditches, embankments in precise geometrical array. And again, that's what we see in the Amazon. So Graham says, are these created by completely unconnected culture, or did the ancients, were they sharing a shared knowledge that enabled them to do this? And actually, I don't think he was actually on the ground at these mountains, because I think I heard he's been banned from visiting the Ohio earthworks.
Oh,
Isn't that crazy?
well, I was wondering that, and we talked a little bit before we got on here, and I was saying like that I understand why Graham gets branded with the pseudoscience label, but I wonder how much more he is kind of dancing on that line, because he's not, he would never go out as far as on the limb as I am, or maybe he would, just not publicly. But like, it feels like he's trying really hard to accept the box of academia puts him in, and then theorizing a little bit outside of that when he can. And I think that, I wonder if it's from things like this. It's like that he wouldn't have access to a lot of these sites because he's getting too big and he's saying these things,
Right.
and like they would say, no, you can't come here because we don't want a Netflix show saying outlandish things that do not fit into our narrative.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something, and I would agree that Graham definitely is, like I was telling you, I've been kind of surprised watching the show. I like it a lot. One thing that surprised me a little bit is that here you've got Graham Hancock, which most, at least in the alternative history camp, would consider to be the pioneer of ancient history from an alternative lens, of meaning there's more than we've been told.
Mm-hmm.
He's, using precious minutes of each episode to interview no-name people we've never heard of who are touting the mainstream line, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
like Graham could have used those minutes to tell us something even deeper about this site. But again, maybe he's using it kind of as a bridge um, to point more to his books, but interesting.
No, I think, it's funny. Like, I could have a lot of things that I could, if I could just, things that I don't like about the things he says, but I'll give him credit for sure about that. I probably would not have been interested in a lot of this stuff if I didn't hear his takes. And I think that, like, in the same way that I can watch something I find to the far end of outrageous is like Ancient Aliens, and I thought the show was interesting. And it's like, you don't have to believe it all, but I think that I do enjoy that he is going places and he's getting, audiences that would never accept any of this stuff. Probably like, because they would see Ancient Aliens, they would think it's obviously preposterous and not even want to look in any further. But they'll see him going to places. And so even if you don't agree with his conclusions, I do think it's good that people are asking questions of themselves, like, well, how did they do that? And how are these people connected? Is it possible? And
Yeah.
then, so then it leads maybe hopefully people to do their own research.
And Graham points out how many of these Ohio earthworks feature precise alignments to specific solstices and equinox, but remarkably, even more than that, is he states how they were built to align directly with even more complex lunar cycles, which is crazy when you think about it. Even if these are 2,000 years old, I think that actually might be older. But these people were masters of the heavens in a sense. Like, why did they have such an intense interest in the heavens, in aligning to the equinoxes, the moon, the solstices? They had this astronomical knowledge that your average person today knows nothing about. His big takeaway is this evidence of a lost civilization that had a legacy of ideas from a far older culture. And speaking of these Ohio mounds, one of the most famous ones is called the Serpent Mound. Have you heard of that?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That one's wild.
The Serpent Mound in Ohio, everybody's got to Google this and look it up. because it's the largest, serpent-like effigy on the planet, I believe. Do you find that interesting, JT, that at a serpent mound was found the skeleton of, like, I think it was an 8+ foot skeleton?
In Ohio?
Yeah.
See, I never heard that before. I mean, that's obviously very significant. I think that again, if it tracks with everything else, that if you find elongated skulls in South America, and then you have megaliths and earthworks and mounds and things, and you find similar structures, maybe not to the extent in America, it does make sense that there is a connectivity. That's fascinating, though, that I've never heard of that. It's funny because I've got this shirt. I've got my research, the Smithsonian shirt on it. So
There you go.
maybe there's a reason I don't know about it, is because it's not. It should be something that's obviously widely reported, but it's not.
Yeah. Okay, here's the information I was looking for. So this Great Serpent Mound measures 1,370 feet long. It stands 3 feet high, and the serpent winds back and forth more than 800 feet in 7 coils. And you can see the serpent head, it has an open mouth, which is looks like it's about to bite an egg, which is interesting. And this area that it's on straddles what's called an impact meteor crater, which, according to Hugh Newman, has powerful magnetic and gravitational anomalies associated with it, going deep into the earth. And so, as with many other mounds, Serpent Mound was built on this magnetic hotspot. Hugh Newman recounts in his book, Giants on Record, just prior to 1891, Professor Frederick Ward Putnam, who did all of the known excavation work at Serpent Mound, opened up one of the burial mounds on the property of Great Serpent Mound and unearthed a 9-foot long by 5-foot wide grave, where the skull fragments inside had twice the usual thickness, according to Putnam. There is also an old postcard that was discovered from the late 1800s of an ancient skeleton during an excavation, and the caption reads, "Skeleton of mound builder, 7 feet in length." But you can see in the photo the skeleton's legs are cut off, so Hugh believes it was over 8 feet.
So what is believed to be the structure of the mounds? Like, what gives them their shape? Because obviously if it was just dirt at this point, over thousands of years, it would likely have deteriorated more. So, like, is there something substantial under there that's giving it its shape?
Great question. I mean, I guess I've always thought that the unique mounds like the Serpent Mound is probably mostly just earth compiled and packed. But then, like Graham showed Cahokia Mound in Illinois, and that thing goes way up. And that thing does have structure components to it. In fact, some of these mounds, like one of those in Illinois, I was talking to Dr. Greg Little. I did an interview, who's one of the foremost experts on North American mounds. And he was sharing all kinds of discoveries, like in some of these mounds, and he's got an old photo of one. There's a massive, what looks like a granite stone block, perfectly squared. And the thing was so massive, the Smithsonian couldn't
they couldn't hide it.
They couldn't move it. And so it's still there, and they covered it back up.
Oh, wow.
So some of these do have stone-like structures. Some of them do have stone graves in them. But again, one theory that I find very interesting from Dr. Gregory Little is that, because I asked him about giants,
Of course.
Nephilim giants, he calls them Denisovans. They were giants too. But it's kind of a way to not call them Nephilim in a sense.
It's a way to be taken a little more serious.
Exactly. So he was saying he believes that you had this ancient culture that life was centered around these mounds. It was the elites who were these giants that lived in and led the ceremonies in these massive mounds. All that to say, it's interesting, side note, that with mounds, we have to talk about large skeletons as well. After Ohio, episode 5 finds Graham going to Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. And it looks like a windswept place in the middle of nowhere. And here Graham takes us up close, great 4K footage of some of the most amazing ancient ruins in North America. What was your take, JT, on Chaco Canyon?
For one, I'm really interested because I'm going out west here next week. I'm actually going to Utah, but yeah, I'm super fascinated with the stuff out west. I I couldn't help but think that when you see the landscape of that place, is it possible that that was built when it didn't look like that? Because I mean, sometimes I just think like that it doesn't make not a lot of sense for people to, like there's a lot of nice parts of North America now, that people would do stuff in this desolate place. Just like it looks like, and if they were trying to grow stuff, where were they growing stuff around there? Because they mentioned like that some of the solstice alignments were about crops and things. And it's like, what were they growing out there?
Yeah, it was such a desolate area. And it's like, why would anybody come out to the middle of nowhere to build one of the biggest ancient structures in North America, or at least in what we call the United States today,
Mm-hmm.
in Chaco Canyon? And you see these structures, and it's not just one structure. There were structures all over, kind of the
Mm-hmm.
general area. There was the one structure, I'm trying to remember the name, that was the biggest, Pueblo Bonita,
Yeah.
rising
Mm-hmm.
several stories. And it was like this labyrinth of rooms, corridors, vast circular semi-subterranean enclosures. And it was this huge construction project that had hundreds of rooms. And mysteriously, some of these rooms were like made to go nowhere. Archaeologists have been working there decades, and we still don't have a whole lot of answers onto why this structure is here. What were they doing?
Yeah, and all they can really attribute to is like rituals were done there. It's there. I think there's something missing in their story. I mean, for one, I thought again, it's like they're dealing with the very narrow parameters of like that. I thought was interesting that I listened for. The thing I did not hear there is they were saying they were the ancestors of the Pueblo, and I've always heard them as named as the Anasazi, the ancient ones.
Right.
And so like nobody really knows who they are. I mean, people. I believe the Pueblo, and I think was it the Dobie Native Americans claim to be related to them, but I mean nobody really knows because they're like it's like literally the story is that they went missing about 1,000 years ago.
Right.
And we know, and we obviously know by now that's just a guesstimate because we really don't know. So what did they do and why did they do it? I thought the things that were really just like kind of, I was just shaking my head when I was hearing it. They were saying it took at least 200 years to build this. And they were saying they got that based on the tree rings of the beams in there. And I was like, wait a minute. Okay, so I mean, I could be completely wrong about this because I don't really know about dating things like this. But I figured you could date a tree based on how many rings it had, based on how many seasons it's lived. Like each
Yeah.
season it gains a new ring. Okay, so with that being said, if you chopped a tree down and you made a beam out of it, like how do you date something after that, and how do you determine that it took 200 years because you found two different beams? I was confused by that. And also the funny part was when they were saying like that it was aligned to certain solstices and they would use that to plant their crops. I'm like, but it took a couple hundred years to make though. So like would that have really been a good use of your time? You're trying to
Right.
determine when the solstices are. I think the place is obviously, to me, it's more like a mystery. Like
Yeah.
were rituals done there? Sure, maybe that sounds plausible. But yeah, like the amount of resources that it would take in to do this, it it's like I said, it's kind of incomprehensible that people in a very primitive time would have done this. For what reason? I think to me it's always I always go back to the idea that I don't believe that people who could construct could do construction projects like that didn't have good reasons, and it wasn't just superstition. I think that there likely was a very practical use of this many resources.
Hmm.
I think I do kind of wonder too, like when you like even I was thinking about the serpent mounds. It's like if there is this, evidence of like buried things all around the world, it's like what if you dug way deeper into the ground in there?
Mhm.
What if that was just the tops of some of these places? Like what if there's stuff that's under there that we just don't know about? Because yeah, like one, even it's a big building, but one building, it's like you had needed a lot of like logistics to construct that. Where were the people living that were building it? Right.
Yeah, even the official that Graham interviewed there said that construction began about 850 AD. So just fascinating that right here, ancient civilizations were building this stuff. He says 850 AD. Maybe it was earlier. But again, the guy even said, like you said, he said the people who built this we refer to them as the ancestral pueblo. They settled in the Chaco Canyon and they wanted it to be the center of their culture. Again, archaeologists found more than 100 ritual burials, along with pottery, again, with strange patterns. They found stuff that came from Mexico and California, seashells, uh, copper bills, I think, from Mexico that were in there. So Graham made the point that it's like they put enormous effort to make this the center of the world out in the middle of nowhere, and like people were drawn to this place. And Graham makes the comparison of this place to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey with all the circular kiva-like structures. One thing I thought Graham said that I'll close on this and turn it over to you, JT. He said it's like this Chaco Canyon structure, all of them combined to form a ritual calendar laid out upon the earth. And he basically said Chaco Canyon bears the fingerprints of a culture of highly sophisticated astronomers. And I think he also said it may have been chosen as a terrestrial counterpart to the Milky Way. What were your thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, I mean it's very clear or it's unclear how these people had such a grasp of the heavens that they could do these kind of things. It was tripping me out especially when he's talking about, even like you mentioned, that some of these earthworks are lined up with the moon cycles. I mean, really think about how complicated that sounds. The moon you can't see the moon all the time. Like, that's, and when you can't see it, it's at nighttime. So the idea that these people have what were these moon cycles that were 18 and a half years apart, and these things had some kind of alignment with these things. Yeah, there's so much that would need to go into that. Like, yeah, so you think about this, that's advanced. That's really advanced. Not just the structures, but the idea that they could do these things and it would be accurate
Right.
to some alignment that's in the heavens. I mean, to me, it's yeah. Again, when these people are talking about contacting entities, it's like I think you have to believe them when they can do that kind of thing. Like, why else would they? Like, how else could they? How else can you explain it? If you
Yeah.
don't believe they have the normal scientific equipment like we would have today, well, how could they do it to that kind of accuracy? I mean, I think there's obviously something there.
Yeah, there's so much interesting enigmas and anomalies in that Four Corners region, whether it's New Mexico, Arizona, Utah. I did an episode with a lady who has done a lot of research regarding some of the strange petroglyphs in Utah. And there was one, I think it was called the Intua Basin. These are some of the most bizarre petroglyphs you've ever seen. And one of them, you might have seen a picture I posted, JT. I call it the six-fingered Bigfoot.
Mm-hmm.
This thing's got literally six fingers on one hand, horns coming out of its head, and giant feet. I mean, if that's not a strange entity, I don't know what is. But to your point, maybe they were just painting what they saw.
I mean, I think it makes sense. It's like that. I think that in general, like you wouldn't add an extra finger to something unless it probably had an extra finger. Like everybody knows how many fingers everybody's got. That's weird. It's interesting. I was thinking about an old video I made years ago, and I went out to Vegas over at the beginning of the year, and I finally made it over to the Hoover Dam. And if you go into the Hoover Dam, they have all those designs, like the same designs you'd find on the pottery, the same designs you'd find through the ayahuasca ceremonies. They have on the floors, on the terrazzo floors at the Hoover Dam. I think that's pretty interesting. At one point, I just thought, oh, well, what they would tell you is just it's an homage to the natives. They're there. But interesting, like when you think about how they got those designs for the pottery.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of interesting, like that's the kind of stuff that they would use to decorate the dam, the Hoover Dam, which obviously is very significant, for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, I've always wondered that too. But I remember as a kid, I drove out west and we went to like some of the cliff dwellings of like the Anasazi.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like it was so bizarre, like to think, like, why would they carve into the mountain and put these things in here? And you're like, I wonder, it seems to be, it makes sense to me that there must have been predators on the ground. It could have been wild animals, could have been Therion, could have been six-fingered giants. Like, why else would they do that instead of build stuff on the ground?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, point taken. You look at the dwellings of the Anasazi way up in those cliffs when they could have just done it on the ground for 1,000,000 hours less the work, right? Why build up there? What were you trying to hide from?
I don't know. It just seems to me like that I can see obviously what Graham Hancock is saying, like that there's this connectivity between North and South America based on, earthworks, different structures, maybe like the ceremonies. These people have this commonality between places. And even based on the mainstream take is like that at some point these peoples walked from the Bering Strait and all this kind of stuff, and they made their way down. We really don't even know how old this stuff is. Like, obviously that stuff in Chaco Canyon, it's ruins.
Yeah.
So maybe they're more well preserved in a place like South America, which obviously seems like it's way more plush.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It doesn't look like such a harsh environment. Maybe those things lasted in the Amazon versus like this desolate area that it does really look like there was an apocalypse there at some point. Like that's what it looks like in there. I mean, like, it's funny to even think about if you watch post-apocalyptic movies, that's where they film them because it looks like whatever worst case scenario in the world could happen. It looks like it happened there at some point in our, I don't know when.
Well, it was an interesting episode, especially how he weaved the ayahuasca part through all of it. I've talked with a couple of people who have taken ayahuasca, and they have definitely shared that they saw strange entities. And one of them told me that the entity that revealed themselves to her was Quetzalcoatl.
Oh, wow.
Whom the Inca also called Viracocha. And so I thought that was kind of wild to hear this story.
Yeah,
So,
what's interesting is, again, I never realized this until like a year or two ago about that's why you get like the Native American headdresses that are the feathers. And I was like, oh, wow, like that's okay. So that's what the feathers are, because if they worshipped Amaru in South America and Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, same thing. And so your chief is wearing all the feathers.
So you're saying that's where the feathers do come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, it's kind of one of those things where like almost like oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, I guess you just see these things, and again, like, people have their reasons for doing these kind of things. It makes sense if these people, obviously, for whatever you want to say, they're very spiritual people that were doing this.
Well, JT, thanks for your time. Tell everybody what you're working on next and how can they follow you.
Yeah, I mean, I said, as I mentioned earlier, I'm working on like JT's mixtape, and I think that overall it's kind of like a way for me to talk about lots of things. You know, sometimes things are not worth an hour podcast. Sometimes they're worth about 5 minutes worth of conversation. So, and and I want to keep this fun and light. And so if you see, like, obviously the stuff we talk about, the mud flood stuff, like I love talking ancient stuff with Derek over here. So I mean, like, it's anything that kind of like sticks in my craw, even if it's like the craziest things about, like, is Kanye a clone, or is Stevie Wonder, can he see, you know, that kind of stuff. So like, so yeah, if you want to see more of that mixed in with ancient apocalypse stuff, you know, mud flood stuff, yeah, you can check me out on Instagram. JT follows JC, YouTube, you know, TikTok, all that stuff. But yeah, the podcast is going to be on YouTube mostly. I do a little stuff on Rumble. Sometimes the videos get a little too hot for YouTube, so we have to put them to the other side of things, just to stay on the safe side. But yeah, right, yeah. This is awesome. Like I said, I love talking about this stuff, because I think that, if anything, it's fun to question this stuff, because I think that how else are we going to figure any of this stuff out?
Well, thanks for your time, bro. It's exciting to see all the great content you're putting out. So everybody, follow JT, and we'll see you in the near future, bro.
All right, man. Appreciate it. God bless.